Happy Tuesday and happy 2017 basketball fans. Here are your TrogCast, two really old guys talking NCAA basketball. First time in the new year. I'm Jeff Zink here, and we're talking to Jim Reaker as well. Jim, just back from the sunny south. How you doing?
Doing great this morning. A little bleak here in the Ohio Valley. Woke up this morning, no palm trees, no mountains, but I guess I'll survive as the college basketball season is moving now into what we kind of classify as the second season, and you originally said you don't get interested and excited about it until this season.
That's right, and there's lots to be excited about as we go into it. Fresh and quick starts to all the big conferences, and we'll be going through them one by one. Of course, one of the big news is we're down to 3 undefeated teams now. Nova or Creighton was going to have to lose, and Nova dropped Creighton last Saturday. And the big news, and we'll talk about that later when I get into the Pac-10, Oregon coming back from its short sojourn away to drop both UCLA and USC from the undefeated. So now we only have Villanova, Baylor, which has now moved up to number 2, and number 5 Gonzaga, who've got ovals in the loss columns. And, it just goes to show what happens when true conference play begins.
I'll just remind you a few weeks ago we were talking about the unbeatens. I think we had 10 or 12 at that time, and we kind of made our choices who would last the longest. Just want to remind you, I chose Villanova and Gonzaga at that time, and once again, I'm right on cue there.
Well, let's not get too happy. I think in that same broadcast you decided that Davidson was going to upset Kansas. So
I don't remember saying that.
I don't. Yeah, of course. Now we'll have to go back to the tape. But yeah, you went with Villanova, and I said the winner of that Gonzaga St. Mary's game, where St. Mary's has dropped since then, but it could still end up being that St. Mary's could drop it. Gonzaga's got it pretty good. It'll be interesting to see. We'll see how it goes as we go through this first week of conference play. We just sort of want to walk through with you fans what's happened here. Like Jim said, I think the preseason is almost like baseball's preseason, a lot of exhibition games. Some good games in there too, but you find out who's who within your conference when you start playing each other. And let's start with the ACC. Now the ACC has got 7 teams in the top 25 and 2 more on the edge, with teams very close to popping into that top 25. We usually go by the AP top 25 here on the program. And just another article, we've mentioned this several times, Jim. Joe Lunardi of ESPN thinks there may be even as many as 11 teams from the ACC could go to the tournament, depending on how things fall. The last place team right now is the team we talked about both here and on our Xavier cast, the Razor cast, is Wake Forest. They're at 9-5. But 3 of those losses come to top 25 teams, and the others are against Northwestern and Clemson. And that's one of the teams that Lunardi thinks could sneak in there. So it's going to be an interesting week. Let's just sort of walk through the ACC, and I know you got some things to add for that before we go to one of your conferences. Some great games this past week, which will tell you how tough it is in conference play. Pitt loses in the last second to Notre Dame, and nobody really expected Pitt to vie for much. Notre Dame's one of the early surprises. And North Carolina opens conference play by losing to Georgia Tech by 12. On top of that, in the game we previewed last week, Louisville loses to Virginia in a great game, but then they bounce right back and take down Indiana. But Virginia has to turn right around, play again, and then they lose to Florida State at home, which is only the second time in the past 37 games that Virginia has lost at home. So big doings there. Of course, one of the biggest things that's going on is just Duke. We talked a little bit last week about Grayson Allen being out, and I think they miss his strident competitiveness, but the tripping incident, and now Coach K has stripped him of the captaincy, and they go out and they lose to Buzz Williams' Virginia Tech squad in their first conference game. And then on top of that, we've got Coach K announcing that he's going to have back surgery for a herniated disc and could be out 4 to 6 weeks. Jeff Capel will take over the seat. So a lot of things going on there in the ACC, which might turn around some of our early season discussions.
Well, you got to look at, if you open up the standings, they're almost upside down on what you would have predicted, although we got to be careful here. Most of them have only played one league game. Florida State and Wake Forest are the only two that already have 2 games on in. But so don't get too excited. But the thing that was kind of shocking was Duke, North Carolina, Wake Forest, and North Carolina State, the famous 4 on Tobacco Road, all lost on the same day, and that hasn't happened very many times in history. But, I want to go to and ask your opinion about what's going on at Duke. They were highly anticipated, highly ranked early on. Some people believe they had the best team in the country because they had 3, 5-star recruits coming in as freshmen, although all 3 of them, I think, were hurt and didn't start the season. Then you had Grayson Allen, who was injured, finally did make it back. And then we had the tripping incident. And then you have Luke Kennard, who's, played better than all of them. My question is, what's going on at Duke? Is this Coach K maybe given his assistant an audition? I mean, the timing to me kind of seems strange. Although I did hear the story, the report first came out that he's been trying to deal with this in other means and just got to a point where he decided he needed surgery to relieve the pain and that he's kind of been hiding it from the public. That could be true. But the other thing you got to think about is Mike Krzyzewski is no spring chicken. In fact, I looked up, he's turned 70 in February. Is this maybe the precursor to Coach K saying, I'm finished? Is that what's going on here? Did the tripping incident and having to deal with Grayson Allen? We've talked about the modern basketball player athlete. They're different to deal with. Is Coach K, again, he's coached in a different era when he started, and things were different and players were different. Is he contemplating saying, I just don't enjoy coaching these type of players anymore, the attitudes they have or what it takes to coach them? Just kind of interesting, the timing with it all taking place right here at the beginning of the league season. So, again, I don't know if there's a lot to read into it or not. Just wonder what your take is on that.
You make some good points there, Jim. I don't think this is like a Steve Spurrier situation in football where he quit at South Carolina a couple of years just saying he didn't have it anymore. You hit on a lot of the things. Coach K is 70. He's had his health issues throughout the year. You remember this even happened 20 years ago. He in the 95-96 season, he coached the first 12 games before leaving for another back surgery and to recover from what he called exhaustion. So everybody thought that might be the end of him there, and it's 20 years later. But I think the key about that season is what you worry about for the Duke season is Pete Gaudet took over when they were 9-3, and he only went 4-15. They were only 2-13 in conference play that year. So that's what you got to worry about, the transition there. I think the biggest problem with Duke is, and Krzyzewski did shift a few years ago. I mean, he was one of the ones that was the most adamant against the one-and-dones, tried to stay away from them. He publicly pronounced that when you come to Duke, you're coming to get a degree and to be a student-athlete. He's had to shift that to keep him competitive, and he's done okay with that. You got to remember, this is a guy that won a championship not that long ago. It's not like he's been on the schneid. And he has cut back on his schedule. He's dropped most of his commitments to U.S. basketball, so he's not going to be doing the Pan Am Games and the Olympic Games and all that. So I think that's his way of saying he's pulling back to dedicate himself to Duke. But we'll see how he bounces back and also how the Dukies do in these next 4 weeks. I think the biggest problem has just been getting these kids on the court healthy. Harry Giles has played in just 3 games, and Jason Tatum and Marcus Bolden just in 6. And it takes a while. By the tournament, we always say they're not freshmen anymore. These guys didn't even really get a preseason. So I think it's a little too early to read maybe a little conspiracy theory in there. Jeff Capel's a very capable assistant. Let's hope they have a better transition than they did in 95-96. But you're right. It might be the point where Coach K has to start looking at the beginning of the end. But I think this is just a procedure he'd hope to get through the season on and just figured that he couldn't do it. He's dealt with things like Grayson Allen in the past. He'll get through it again, and as you've often said, team chemistry has a lot to do with that. I think they'll come back. The loss to Va-Tech, I mean, that was one of the teams that I thought was a year away from contending. Maybe Buzz Williams has got them further along than we thought.
Yeah, it's like I said, right now in my mind, the ACC is upside down where I thought it would be. Again, it's just 1 or 2 games into it, so let's not jump to big conclusions on some of those early games. The other name I'll just throw out there that I've always thought, we know Coach Krzyzewski's not going to coach forever, but I always thought Steve Wojciechowski at Marquette, who played for Coach K and coached for Coach K, I thought he might be the one that if he had some success at Marquette, might be the one who comes back to take over the Duke program, because I think he's a true Dookie through and through. So just always thought about that, but obviously he's not available for this audition if that's what it is, and we don't know if that's what it really is. But, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out, because if the Dukies lose another game or 2 here, now I think Coach K is coaching either tonight or tomorrow night before he has his surgery, and then it's going to be a 4-week layoff. But it'll be interesting to see it. And it shocked me. I thought, oh, yeah, this happened to Coach K about 10 years ago. And then I went and looked it up. No, it was, as you said, it was 20 years ago. And it didn't seem that long ago. So it'll be interesting to see. But, again, it just shows the ACC is just probably the most competitive conference, top to bottom.
Top to bottom, no doubt. And they're going to beat on each other. I mean, even this coming week, North Carolina, which is dropping out to 14th, has to go to a Clemson squad, which has pulled a couple of neat upsets and played some people to tough late nights. Louisville's fun run continues because it's got to go to South Bend and play number 23 Notre Dame. And Va-Tech, which is now in the top 25 after that big win, they've got to go to Florida State, who's been surprising, and then they get to turn right around and host Duke on Tuesday. So it just doesn't end in the ACC. They're going to pound on each other until the first week of the tournament. I'm not talking about their tournament. I'm talking about the NCAA tournament, and we'll just have to see how it goes. With Coach K, I think we're just going to have to revisit that come around tournament time, because if he's going to be gone for 4 weeks or so, it's going to take him a few weeks to get back in the groove. I'm sure they're going to make the tournament, but what shape they're going to be in by then, we won't know for a couple of months.
Yeah, I think your safe bet would be, I think there's like 15 teams with Notre Dame thrown in there for basketball in the ACC. I think a pretty safe bet would be at least 10 of them will be in the NCAA. The bet that would be hard to make is to pick the 10 of the 15 right now that are going to make it, because you look down that list of all 15 of them with Wake Forest sitting at the bottom, maybe Syracuse. Syracuse is just, I don't think it's having the year they thought they would have had some devastating losses leading up to the non-conference season. And, that might be the one you could say, I don't know about them, but the other 14, I think any of the 14 could be in the NCAA depending on how their season plays out in the ACC conference play.
And if you're talking about a coach that might be closer to the end and not able to deal with the one-and-dones, I'd talk more about Jim Boeheim than Mike Krzyzewski.
Yeah, I'm sure he's close to. He's got to be close to 70. Also, I don't have that information available. Don't want to, but he's got to be at least that old.
Well, let's shift to one of your conferences. You wanted to talk about the Big Ten first. Now they've only got 3 teams in the top 25, and none of them are in the top 10. But they had a fun week last week. And they got a fun week, could be this week, for Wisconsin, who's that top-ranked team. But they have to visit the other 2 ranked teams, Indiana and Purdue. And, of course, I'll let you talk about them, because Indiana didn't have much of a fun week last week, and Purdue even got upset in its conference starter with Minnesota.
Yeah, Indiana lost to Nebraska was really kind of a shock. It was played at Indiana, but here I think is the start of another story that's going to get some traction, and I think there's a big game tonight. Wisconsin goes to Indiana. I've gotten texts from my Hoosier friends, and this started when they lost to Nebraska, and then ultimately got kind of pounded by Louisville in Indianapolis. The Crean haters are coming out, and I actually just was on a Indiana chat board right before we went online, and the talk there is exactly what I thought it would be. And if he loses to Wisconsin tonight at home, I think that the drum's going to start beating louder and louder for Tom Crean at IU. He has taken them far in the NCAA a couple times, but a lot of people believe he's a great recruiter, not much of an X and O guy, not much of a pressure down the stretch guy. So that's going to be a story I think the Big Ten is going to be talking about. And again, if Wisconsin beats him tonight, I think that'll be a tough game for him, even though it is at home. The drum beat's going to become louder and louder.
Well, especially after their early season success, where they had those great wins, a couple of them on the road, but against, they beat North Carolina when they were number 3. Now they're down to number 14, so maybe they're not what they thought they were going to be. To beat Kansas early, so they obviously have the talent to do it, but who knows? They've lost recently to Butler and Louisville, and of course the one that you always love to bring up, your Mastodons. So we'll have to see. It's kind of sad to see, because this year, this time last year and the year before, most touts were saying the Big Ten was probably the toughest conference in NCAA men's, and it looks like they're just having a bit of a down year overall.
Well, and you look at the top right now. At the top is Nebraska's 2-0, but so is Michigan State, a team who struggled through the non-conference season. But, of course, one of the reasons people believe that's happened, well, they're young, first off, but also their young star, Miles Bridges, has missed the last 7 games, and they actually lost a game against a team that I can't even remember, was not a team that you thought they would lose to, and it was at home. But right now they're 2-0. I did get a chance to watch them play against Minnesota, and Minnesota is one of those teams that I called, we talked about last week. They look pretty good. They had a pretty good record, and I said, they're going to get a test. They get Michigan State. We know Michigan State will be well prepared, but they get them at home. I watched that game. It actually went into overtime. Minnesota had a great chance to win that game, but Michigan State, and again, I think it came down to it was Tom Izzo, who's been there time and time again, against Rick Pitino Jr., who's not been there in the big game near the end. And I think Izzo and his young players won out, and I'd give Tom Izzo the win there. He was probably the factor that brought them through that game. Miles Bridges is supposed to be back sometime in the next week, so Michigan State could just take off here. They played a tough schedule. We've talked about that before, that Izzo even apologized to his team for giving them such a brutal non-conference schedule. But sometimes I think, and there's other situations we can look at, I think teams who have gone out and played the tough games, and especially gone out and played tough games on the road, and they've taken losses, but I think the experience might lead them when the conference starts to be more ready than teams who played maybe a cupcake schedule with a nice record, like a 12-1 record, but you look and who have they played?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. Michigan State's going to be there at the end, and we've talked about that before. Just a matter of who else might emerge from there, and it's not looking like all that strong. Quite possibly, this could be the time that Coach Collins takes Northwestern to the NCAA for the first time. That would be quite a coup and a feather in his cap. Let's continue on down.
Well, you talk about Northwestern. I wanted to talk about Northwestern just a little bit, in that they were another one who had this great record, and they ended up 1-1, but they lost to Michigan State at home, and that was a great test for Michigan State. They had 2 great tests. Actually, I think that game was at Michigan State, now that I recall. But they could be there. The other team I think you got to look at, don't have a great overall record, is Nebraska. They beat Indiana and they beat Maryland, and Maryland's no slouch. And then you look at their record, they're 8-6, but 4 losses there: UCLA, Virginia Tech, Creighton, and Kansas. I mean, that's a brutal schedule. But again, I want to talk about maybe that's why they're playing so well right now, it's paid off to play that brutal schedule in the preseason, and now they're ready for the league. So Nebraska's another one I think you need to watch. Minnesota, not giving up on them. They actually went to Purdue and won a game at Purdue. That's a big win for them. So I think Nebraska and Minnesota might have something to say, but I'm going to stay with my preseason or pre-league pick of Wisconsin. I just believe ultimately they're going to be the team that's the toughest and will, day in and day out, they're going to win it.
All right. That's great stuff. We'll keep tabs on the Big Ten. Let's move on to another conference that doesn't have a lot of firepower, and that would be the SEC. Not much really happened. They have two teams in the top 25, of course, Kentucky, and there's just not much going on with anybody overall. Florida has snuck into the top 25 as well, and could be this year's sleeper there. The one that had a rough week, though, was South Carolina Gamecocks. They started off strong. They were one of our surprise teams. Now they've lost 3 of their last 5 to Seton Hall, Clemson, and Memphis. So no shame in any of those 3 names as storied programs, but 2 of those were at home. So there might be some cracks in Frank Martin's group down there. Like I say, they're the one that I said might be a year or 2 away as Martin builds his program. But the big news out of Columbia is Sindarius Thornwell has been restored to the team after being suspended for undisclosed violations, and that's just in time for conference play. They dropped out of the top 25, and he's one of their top scoring strengths, and that's what they've missed. How they perform the next 2 weeks is going to be crucial. Nobody really has talked much, not the coach, not the administration, or Sindarius himself, about what the suspension was about. He did get himself in a little trouble over the summer, but they're ready to go. But now, the next couple of weeks, they see a mix of second division SECers that they got to play Georgetown, Tennessee, and Mississippi, and one upward hopeful, one of the surprises so far in the SEC, Texas A&M, will tell if they're going to be okay, because then after that they get back-to-back games against Florida and Kentucky, and if they're not back on speed by then, we'll know that they're a spoiler instead of a contender. And really the only game of note coming up in the SEC is that Kentucky tonight hosts those Texas A&M Aggies. Again, their surprises, their only losses are to USC, UCLA, and Arizona, but then they slipped at home against Tennessee in their conference opener. So it's hard to tell how seriously to take Texas A&M.
Yeah, that'll be a good measuring stick tonight. Again, you look at those losses. I just pulled that up. I see they have 4 losses. I thought, well, who are they to? But you look, the first 3 were to very good teams, 2 of them who were undefeated until just last weekend, and then Arizona, which has always been tough and dealt with some injuries themselves. And all their games were close. Actually, Tennessee had the biggest margin on them. And I've heard some the pundits thinking that Tennessee might be better than people originally thought they were in the preseason. They might be somebody who can play spoiler. So, yeah, I think and we never know what to expect from UK. They're usually pretty good at home, but with the young players they have, I've been kind of one of their critics of their players and their play. Yeah, they can light it up. They got 3 or 4 guys probably going to be in the NBA next year. But, again, basketball is a team game, and sometimes when it's come down to pressure situations, they haven't pulled games out at the end. They were against tough opponents. So I'll probably be watching a little bit of that game just to see how the young pups react, now that we're into the grind of the season, see how they react to that.
Yeah, you're perfectly right. In Tennessee, you're right, too. 4 of their losses are to ranked opponents, Wisconsin, Oregon, North Carolina, and Gonzaga. But they did lose to Chattanooga. So we'll just have to wait and see how things go there. Still not high hopes for many bucket full of teams making the tournament from the SEC this year. Well, it was a typical start to the Big East season this past week. I'll let you take it away, knowing that that's your playground. Lots of fun things that went there. St. John's drops Butler, then a surprise. DePaul takes Villanova to the last minute. Georgetown's tied with Xavier at the half. It was ahead of Xavier at the half and was tied with them just 3 minutes left. Of course, that was at home as well. So just the Big East being the Big East.
Yeah. The Xavier game, Xavier started out with Providence at home. I wasn't at that game, but I was watching that from Asheville, North Carolina. And as you in one of your texts said, it was kind of a snoozer, which was okay for us Xavier fans. You know, you want to start out strong with a big win at home. But, my attention was drawn because the reporters kept talking about, hey, DePaul is giving a game for Villanova, and I figured, they must be playing at DePaul. No, they weren't. They were playing at the Pavilion, actually, the on-campus arena. But Villanova being Villanova, and Josh Hart being Josh Hart, hit a big three-pointer right near the end with a hand in his face. And that's the thing about Villanova is they know how to finish a game. We knew that coming from last year when they finished many big games by winning them, actually culminating with that national championship win, which went on a last-second shot by Chris Jenkins. So, but that was a surprise, DePaul. And then, even a bigger surprise was that night came about that actually it was the next evening, I believe, that Butler lost to St. John's. And I'll be the first to say that I was very critical of St. John's and Chris Mullins, saying, I don't know what's going on there. I'm not sure Chris Mullins is a great coach. But I have to back off and take a second look at that. They do have 7 losses, but remember they beat Syracuse by about 30 points, I think their last non-conference game. And they beat Butler at home, and we know what Butler can do. We know how they play strong defense. And then they went to DePaul and beat DePaul, so they are 2-0. They're actually tied with Villanova and Xavier at the top of the conference. Now, it doesn't get any easier for the Johnnies as they host Creighton, I believe, either tonight or tomorrow night, and then they play Xavier on Saturday. Now, if they're 4-0 after that, then I'll say Chris Mullins is a good coach and the Johnnies are for real. But that's going to be tough for them. But the Johnnies, and think about this, do you think the Big East would not love for St. John's to be a major player in college basketball, sitting in their top market? In fact, the Big East executives had to be smiling with St. John's and DePaul, 2 of their bigger markets, which have struggled the first 4 years after the reconfiguration of the Big East. Both of them seeming to be okay and being able to play well, but kind of compare it to the ACC, you can't take a night off. If you take a night off, you're probably going to lose a game in the Big East, and that grind is going to start here in the next week, as it's pretty much 2 games every week from now until March when we get into the third season, the NCAA. Creighton and Villanova, interesting game. And actually, I watched the beginning of it, and the announcers are like, Creighton's going to win this game. I think some of them were playing off. Maybe Villanova's not as good as we thought they were with the scare against St. John's. They were playing at home. We've talked about how when you play at Creighton, it's a very tough environment to play at. They packed that place, and I watched the beginning of that game, and actually Creighton jumped out to about a 10-point lead, and you thought, maybe Villanova's not as good. But Villanova is the national champion, and Villanova is good, and Villanova is tough. And what it came down to was not allowing the game to get out of control, keeping it close, edging back into the game. With about 4 minutes left in the game, it was tied, and then Villanova became Villanova, and they made the big shots, and they made the big plays down the stretch in a hostile environment, and they won. When somebody beats Villanova, they got to feel good about themselves, because Villanova comes to play every night. They play defense. They got tough guys that can make shots, and they can make the plays. So the Big East, it's going to be exciting, and Xavier and Villanova will be on the court in Philadelphia early next week. So that'll be a big game coming up. Back to you. Any thoughts on that? Or?
Well, I watched a lot of that Butler-St. John's game, and you watch out for Shamari Ponce. That kid can play, like we talked about in one of the previews. If Chris Mullins can tap the New York market, and that's a kid from the New York area, and you can get those scrappy kids like he was back on Lou Carnesec's court, they're going to be pretty tough. And of course, Nova, you look forward to Xavier, but they've got to go to Butler tomorrow night, and that'll be an interesting thing to see if they can pull off back-to-back away wins, like we said earlier. But that'll
you talk about Shamari Ponce. He's averaging almost 18 points a game and he is from the New York area, but he's also got a Hoosier there, a freshman, Marcus Levet, who's averaging 16.6 points a game. Interesting enough, I looked at their last game at DePaul. Levet didn't even start, but he did have 10 points, so he did play a lot. But, yeah, I'm excited this Saturday. They will be at Xavier. I'll be excited to see those two players. In fact, I heard one commentator call those two together maybe the fastest backcourt in America. So, again, that I'm excited to see that in person. And Xavier's got a tough stretch. They got St. John's coming up this week. On Saturday, they actually don't have a –
33 threes, don't they? The three ranked guys. And we'll be talking about that more. If you want, listen to us on our RazorCast all about Big East and Xavier basketball, and that'll be on Thursday. I'm sure we'll have a lot to say about Xavier's upcoming tough schedule.
Another thing we'll be talking about at the end of that, they have those three ranked teams, and then almost immediately after that, they have their crosstown shootout with UC, who's been doing very, very well in the American Conference. We don't talk about them much just because they're not in one of the power conferences, although, Jeff, I know you are a fan and you follow them a little bit. And they're having a pretty good year, and that game could be a big game. That both those teams keep winning the way they are the next 2 or 3 weeks. There'll be a lot of national attention, I think, focused on that game.
Yeah. Always a highlight of the year here in Cincinnati. Well, let's move on and go back to the big week in the Pac-12. The news of the week there is the reemergence of Oregon. I said last week when we were doing our conference previews that the back-to-backs at home against UCLA and South Carolina just might determine whether they're contender or pretender status, and they came through big time. I've watched most of that UCLA-Oregon game on that court that I think was designed by Jackson Pollock, the painter. One of the Nike things that Phil Knight puts out there. No losers in that game. Oregon was defending a 33-game home streak. UCLA coming in with a number 2 ranking, and it was a very exciting game. At one point, it was over. Both teams had over 25 points in the first 10 minutes. Looked like it might be an NBA game. It ended up being 89-87 with some trading of threes down the stretch with Bryce Alford and Lonzo Ball hitting key threes for UCLA, and Steve Pritchard and a rising star who's back in the lineup, and Dylan Brooks that's just helped the Ducks get back on. Just a fantastic, exciting game. No skin off the Bruins' nose for losing this one. It was in the hostile court, but Oregon may have just found their strut back. They started very high in the top 5 this year. They'd almost dropped out of the top 25. Now they're moving back up. But more telling might even been the next game when they just pummeled USC 84-61. And the thing about the Ducks now, they've got almost a month before they face another ranked opponent. So Coach Altman can get his rotation set and get Brooks good and healthy. But then beginning of February, they've got to take on Arizona, UCLA, and USC back-to-back. And another one, I picked them as my dark horse to win it all out there, was Arizona. They keep creeping up. They held off a spirited Cal team, and then they just throttled what's becoming a disappointing Stanford squad. Sean Miller's just getting the best out of Lauri Markkanen, the foreign player, and Dusan Ristic. And people got to remember, the person they expected to be the best player in this new class, Alonzo Trier, still has to take the court in Arizona. So it's going to be an exciting year in the Pac-12, more exciting than I thought when we previewed just a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, you talk about Oregon, probably last week, and I think we've maybe even said that, you or I, one of the two, maybe both, that might maybe the most disappointing team in the country, as I think they were ranked as high as 4th in the preseason rankings. And if you would have asked me to take a bet, I would have said there is no way that Oregon was going to beat both those teams, both of them undefeated, although I think they had both of them at home, didn't they?
They did. Mm-hmm.
And I would have taken that bet in a heartbeat that they might win one of them. They might upset UCLA. They might upset USC, but there's no way they're going to win both of them. And they did. And, yeah, maybe we're seeing the Oregon that the forecasters saw before the season started, starting to play together. And they'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, lots of things to watch on the West Coast between the teams we just mentioned and another conference we don't talk about much, but Gonzaga and St. Mary's out there in the West Coast Conference. Sometimes it's worth staying up late. No real games of note in the Pac-12 this week, kind of cruising. A lot of top tiers playing lesser tiers, so we'll have to come back to that later, which leads us into your last conference, which is the Big 12. The big game there, I'm sure you think, is Baylor travels to West Virginia, and that's where you predicted earlier in the year that Baylor was going to fall from the ranks of the undefeated. I wonder if you're still sticking to that or something else as you go through what's happened in the beginning of the Big 12.
No, I'll stick to that. I think Baylor's a very good team, but I think they're also very young, and they haven't been there really in basketball. They've been, very good at a couple seasons. Drew's done a great job there of keeping them very competitive. But the thing I will say about the Big 12, as we've been talking about all these other leagues that had surprises as they started their play, is there were no real surprises. The top three, my top three, Kansas, West Virginia, and Baylor, all took care of business. They're all 1-0 in the league. And I'm very impressed with West Virginia. And I think part of it is, we're both very familiar with the likes of Bob Huggins as he coached here in Cincinnati for many, many years with the Bearcats. I almost get the feeling that, and Bob Huggins getting up there in age too, that maybe he's relaxed a little bit. I always thought that maybe one of his downfalls was that his players maybe played off his emotions, which were sometimes a little bit out of control while he was coaching. And I've heard a couple interviews with Coach Huggins. He seems more relaxed, and maybe that team is being a little more relaxed and having a little bit more offensive firepower because of that. And West Virginia, of course, there's Kansas is there, and as always. But I like West Virginia to be right there when it is all said and done. So, yeah, I still would go with West Virginia over Baylor when they play. Big game tonight, maybe. Are they a contender? Are they a pretender? Kansas State, who is 12-1, plays at Kansas. And so we'll see how good Kansas State really is. I don't think they've really played anybody to speak of yet. Actually, they beat TCU only by 6 points in their first conference game. Actually, they beat Oklahoma State. No, Kansas beat TCU and West Virginia beat Oklahoma State. Getting lost in my notes here. Too many notes. But we'll see how the Wildcats do against the Jayhawks tonight. But yeah, the Big 12's kind of gone as expected, but there's some big games coming up.
Yeah. Well, you're right. And you can never tell when those two teams get together, Kansas and Kansas State. It's like the crosstown shootout we just mentioned. It's a big rivalry game. And Kansas is quietly moved up there. The Big 12, they have 3 of the top 7 teams in the latest rankings. It's the only 3 teams they have ranked. And I agree with you. Bob Huggins, you've said it many times, defense wins out in the end. As you say, offense wins games and defense wins championships. And he's always been a defensive-minded coach. Hasn't always been able to combine that with an offense that will get him by. But that should be a very interesting game down in the state just southeast of us in the week to come. Anything else you want to add here before we head on to our trivia and tidbit section?
Well, I'll talk about the Fort Wayne Mastodons. They actually lost their first Summit League game. Much to my disappointment, they went down to Western Illinois 93-91 to open the league, but jumped back and beat Oral Roberts by a score of 102-91. So the Mastodons are a 1-1 in the Summit League. I'm still picking them as my victor. That was a kind of a bad loss. I was thinking they might run the table in the Summit League, and then, of course, that Indiana victory was that. I don't know. We'll discuss that, I'm sure, as the season goes on. How big was that Indiana victory? It was at home. It was over a team that was ranked, I believe, in the top 10 at the time. But, again, we started out the broadcast talking about, is Indiana as good or as well coached as they could be? So that's my only tidbit. But, yeah, I do have a trivia question for you, obviously.
All right. Well, go ahead. Fire away.
Well, we talked about in your conference, the ACC, that all 4 teams on Tobacco Road lost on the same day. That had only happened once before in history, as far as they know, because some of the records back pre-1950s, 40s, the dates of the games were not recorded. But as far as they know, it only happened once before in history. Do you know what year North Carolina Duke, Wake Forest, and North Carolina State also lost on the same day?
Well, in this case, I do, because I read that article to see, because like a lot of articles, they made it seem like this has never, oh my God, it happened just 3 years ago in 2014. That's what I love. When you got to have something to talk about and go, this hasn't happened in a week and a half. But it is true. It doesn't happen often, and they could go back. What would be interesting to see is when was the last time it happened before that. And the article didn't really know. But it's
and maybe it hasn't happened before then. I had the same reaction because the story I saw said all 4 teams on Tobacco Road lose on the same day, and which almost alluded to by the title that this had never happened before.
Yeah.
And then you start reading the article and it says, well, it's only happened once. And you're thinking, it must have been back in the 50s or 60s. And you read it was 2014, not that long ago. So
it's funny, but like I said, it's tough when you see storied programs like that, and it doesn't happen very often. Just a couple clarifications from earlier. Jim Boeheim is 72, so he's up there too. And again, with Boeheim and Krzyzewski, you're talking about 2,000 win coaches, and Hugs, who just won his 800th, is 60 to 63. He's in there, so I mean he's getting up
he's
there.
A pup.
Yeah, but he's got a lot of years left in him compared to how long he's been on the scene. The only little tidbit I have for you today is this date in history, 1981, the Cleveland Cavaliers just approaching to retire the jersey number 34, but it's of Austin Carr, who was a fantastic player at Notre Dame to get you used to. And we'll talk about the modern players at Notre Dame, but if you got to watch Austin Carr play in the late 60s and early 70s, you saw quite a player. He became known as Mr. Cavalier well before another guy's taken over that title in Cleveland. And Austin, I believe he's still one of the Cavaliers radio broadcasters, was the 1971 Naismith College Player of the Year. So got his number retired. He is a College Hall of Famer and in Notre Dame's basketball Ring of Honor.
Yeah, I do recall Austin as in my childhood growing up just minutes from the Notre Dame campus. He was a name that stuck in my mind. He was always a big scorer, put up a lot of points for the Irish, kind of pre-Notre Dame basketball being nationally significant. Back in those days in the late 60s and 70s, of course, it was the football program that everybody paid attention to, but Austin Carr made a name for himself on the Notre Dame campus through basketball.
Yeah. Fantastic program on both fronts. Well, that'll be it for us for this week on the TrogCast. It'll be 2 really old guys. Please join us on our Razorcast, Reaker and Zink on Xavier Basketball, which we publish every Thursday here through the good graces of Mike Goodpasture. And we'll look forward to joining all of you next week on Tuesday as we go over the past week and the oncoming week in NCAA men's basketball. So happy 2017 to everybody, especially to you, Jim, and your growing brood there. 2017 is going to see an official edition, I know, later in the year. And we hope it's a great year for all Reekers and all the NCAA men's basketball fans.
Looking forward to it. And, yeah, I'd like to, again, a great 2017 to all of our listeners. Thanks for listening. Tell your friends about it. And we'll see you next week.